Welcome to Walking with Conviction in an Anxious Age. I'm Pastor Chris Miller. The world is unsettled, but that doesn't mean you have to be. This podcast is for people who want to walk calmly and confidently with Jesus in uncertain times. I'm not here to tell you what to think or what to do. You make your own decisions. My aim is simple: to help you walk with Christ in a way that cultivates Christ-like character through clear thinking, intentional living, and confidence formed by conviction. We'll talk about scripture, culture, faith, and everyday obedience. And together, we'll learn to walk faithfully with Jesus day in and day out. We're walking this road together, faithful, grounded, and free.
One of the strangest things about being human is how quickly we become convinced we understand things we're not actually in a position to understand. We do it with people, we do it with suffering, and sometimes we do it with God. We assume we know what He should do or why He should do it, and how things should work out. But what happens when life refuses to fit inside our expectations? What happens when suffering, uncertainty, disappointment, and silence expose the limits of our understanding? This week, we continue our journey through formation and suffering with one of the most important stops along the way: humility before mystery. Because peace may not come from mastering reality. It may come from finally accepting our position before God. And we've been traveling this path of formation this year. Formation is a slow, faithful work God does in us as truth is lived out under pressure over time. It's not about quick fixes, emotional highs, or constant activity. It's about becoming steady, faithful people, shaped and formed in Christ in real life. And this year is not primarily about doing more. It's about becoming more deeply formed. Sometimes we do things just to stay busy, but that's not what this is about. As we started out earlier in the year, we learned that there were problems to be solved and tensions to be managed, two very different things. There are things in life that are sources of tension that we have to learn to manage because they're not going anywhere. And then there are other things that are problems that we solve, but we learn to become comfortable with tension because it's always going to be present in our lives. And we find peace in tension when we remain close to the Lord in that tension. We continued from there with ordered love. Sometimes well-meaning Christians have been taught or picked up the idea somewhere along the way that pleasure and comfort are wrong. But the reality is that our desires are good God-given desires. And when we exercise those desires inside of His intended context, they are very good. It's when we get outside of God's boundaries that they become a problem. That's when they become sinful. When we looked at the order in which we should love things: God is highest, then His will, people, then calling, responsibility, and comfort and the pleasure down there at the bottom. It's okay to love them, we just need to keep them in the right order. And we can and should love all those things, we just keep them in the spot they're supposed to be in. One thing that can jumble up that order very quickly is suffering. It destroys pleasure and comfort. Sometimes our world can shrink down to where all we see is suffering, and then it works its way all the way to the top of our order of love. And that's when difficult things happen. It's imperative to remember that we love things in their proper order. Everyone suffers. We're not going to avoid it or shortcut it. It's a tension to manage, not a problem to solve, and it requires proper perspective and ordered love. So we've been looking at finding peace, suffering well in the past few episodes. It's important to understand that we're not creating peace, we're not building peace, we're finding it. In our quest for peace, we've dismantled some false assumptions. We've deconstructed the illusion of control. We've discovered the violence of bad theology and the damage it can do by speaking with certainty to things we don't fully understand, like Job's friends. We've learned about lament, the process of bringing our pain into the presence of God and asking bold questions and trusting the Lord. And last week, we reached a crossroads where we exposed the fragility of relying on explanation and circumstances as a means of finding peace. And at that crossroad, down one road lies deeper faith and trust, down the other, bitterness and resentment. As we continue down the path of formation, we come to another one of many necessary stops: humility before mystery. In many ways, it brings together everything else we've seen along the way so far. At the same time, it's an easy stop to miss, and I think many people do, even long-time believers. But it's imperative that we stop here if we're going to find peace. We tend to think we occupy a higher position than we do. One of the strangest human traits is our ability to become fully convinced that we understand things we are not in a position to understand. We do that all of the time. We assume to understand the motives, reasons, intentions behind what other people do, and we make assumptions. We believe those assumptions and we act on them as if they are factually true. And it's very difficult to disconnect ourselves from doing that. And we have to do the same thing with God. We assume we know what he's doing and why he's doing it, why something's happening in someone's life, kind of like Job's friends. Now, it's not always rebellious to do that. Sometimes we do it sincerely without realizing we don't understand what's actually happening. And we see in the book of Job that God himself declared Job to be blameless and upright, but Job suffered severely. His friends thought he was suffering because he had done something wrong, but that wasn't true. They made the assumption, acted on the assumption, but they were wrong. Job has been lamenting, grieving, questioning. He's defending himself from the accusations of his friends. And after all of that goes on for a while, God finally speaks to Job. And God doesn't say what he does to Job to feed his own ego. That's obvious. He doesn't intend to crush or humiliate Job. God said exactly what Job needed to hear, the way he needed to hear it, when he needed to hear it, to change Job's perspective. And he does that by asking Job a series of questions. God asked Job, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Can you command the morning? Do you provide food for the raven?" And God is not asking for answers. He doesn't need them. He already knows the answers to that. He uses questions to show Job that Job is trying to evaluate reality from a perspective that he doesn't have, from a position he doesn't hold. Job doesn't possess the knowledge to understand what's happening. Of course, we read about it. We have a better picture of what happened to Job than Job does. And that's when God speaks to Job, that's a humbling experience for Job. Listen to how he responds in chapter 40, verse 3 through 5. It says, "Then Job answered the Lord and said, Behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I will lay my hand over my mouth. Once I have spoken, but I will not answer. Yes, twice, but I will proceed no further." In saying what he does, Job isn't humiliated into silence. He's actually humbled into perspective. Job uses the word vile to describe himself, and to our modern ears, that sounds like he's saying I'm disgusting or worthless or something like that. But the word behind vile carries the idea of small or brought low. It's a word that communicates perspective. Job is admitting that he has overstated his perspective and has been speaking to realities that are beyond his vantage point. And that's something we all do at times, which is not always wrong. We just need to be careful that in doing so, we're not assuming a position we don't hold. And part through questioning Job, God says, "Answer me if you can." And he tells Job that, but he knows Job can't answer. And God is showing Job in that he is human, he's finite, limited, and that he has assumed a vantage point of reality that he doesn't actually possess. Job, through this, he hasn't lost value, he hasn't lost intelligence, but he has lost the illusion that he occupies a position of greater understanding than he actually does. And that's a constant tension that we deal with. There's a constant tension between God's vantage point and our own vantage point. We often assume understanding we don't possess without even realizing it. We assume things. And that's hard for us to understand. It's hard to explain, maybe even accept. And that's partly why Job says to God, I've heard with my ears, but now I see. Job had been evaluating God from a position no human actually occupies. And that's not rebellion, it's humanity. And we all do that. We assume a position of understanding we don't have without even thinking about it. And as Job grieves, he subtly begins trying to solve the equation of what's happening in his life. He's lost his health, his wealth, his family. He says things like, I have sought to walk uprightly. My life is being crushed. And at first, that sounds pretty reasonable. But gradually, he moves from lamenting to cross-examining how God governs reality. And in doing so, likely without even realizing it, he begins to assume he has enough information to analyze how that should be done. And we've all heard people do that. We've even done it ourselves. And we assume a perspective and knowledge that humans don't have. Suffering often clarifies the limits of our understanding. It brings up questions that we can't answer. When that happens, we find ourselves in a position where we need to choose between trust or the illusion of control. Trust is the road that leads to accepting the limits of human understanding, which requires humbling ourselves. It leads to a deeper faith, a deeper trust, and spiritual growth. The road to bitterness and resentment involves hanging on to the illusion of control and assuming we have answers to questions we can't answer. And for most of us, if you're listening to this, there's probably a good sense that most of us would say we trust God. But when we say that, we usually do it from a comfortable place. We're comfortable trusting God when we're comfort. But comfort doesn't challenge trust. That's not actually put to the test until we're in a difficult position. And suffering often shows us that God governs reality from a position we don't understand. A foundational part of faith, trust, spiritual growth, and peace is humbling ourselves and accepting that. Humility begins when we accept our position before God. Humility is having a modest view of who we are in relation to who God is. And something humility does is it replaces assumptions with trust. We feel like humility helps us not feel like we have to have answers and allows us to trust God in things we don't understand. And it's the mystery of God that reveals the limits of human perspective. And up until this point, Job has wrestled with trying to press his suffering into a mold that he can comprehend. He's trying to take things that are beyond his own understanding and fit them inside of human logic. And when God finally speaks to Job, he reveals something that Job had heard, he knew, but he hadn't seen. He didn't have clarity about it. Job knew that God operates from a level of wisdom that is beyond the limits of human understanding. Now, remember Job's friends? They evaluated Job's situation through the lens of tradition, their own experience, and their own certainty. They assumed they knew why Job was suffering, but their understanding was actually quite limited. And like his friends, and us, Job's perspective is limited by his own experience. Also, like Job and his friends, we often assume knowledge beyond our own. The experience and knowledge we have, it's real and it's valid, but it's also limited. There's a boundary around it. As God said about the waves of the sea, you can only come this far. Our experience and our knowledge have a limit. They only go so far. We can't always apply our knowledge and experience in a way that says, this is how God always does things, or this is how things should always happen, because we don't possess the wisdom, the knowledge, the understanding to do that. But God leads Job into a position of clarity where he sees that God holds understanding that is beyond his own. And not just hearing that, but seeing that is a turning point in spiritual maturity, because we often, we hear that and we think we understand that. And it's kind of a challenge to explain a topic in a way that we can understand that we don't understand, if that makes sense. But not just hearing that, but seeing that is a turning point in spiritual maturity. And that's tested when God's actions don't align with our experience, our expectations, and our assumptions. It's counterintuitive, but it's in the things we don't understand, the mysteries of God, that's where we actually find peace. Maybe we've heard that. Maybe we say we believe it. But like Job, we have yet to see it. It's often when we experience chaos, pain that's beyond our control and explanation, and then humble ourselves that we see that. That's where we find peace. Job chapter 42, verse 1 through 3 say, Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do everything, and that no thought can be withheld from you. Who is he who hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Now that last line there it's important. I've uttered what I did not understand. This is where Job sees that he was speaking from a place of limited understanding. And doing that, it's not always wicked or evil. Sometimes it's just limited. And we don't even realize the assumptions we're making when we do it. We've already established that lamenting involves honesty and bold questions. So this isn't about, avoiding knowledge or understanding or seeking knowledge or understanding. It's about humbling ourselves and trusting God within the limits of our understanding, because it is limited. Our faith deepens through honest questions. We just need to remember to be humble in our conclusions and avoid making assumptions. And there's a difference between asking questions and assuming knowledge that we don't possess. And one of the greatest human struggles is a desire to control our circumstances and our environment and to explain them. And the interesting thing about that is that that desire comes from a good God-given desire. That desire goes hand in hand with one of the first commands God gave humans. He said, be fruitful, multiply, fill and subdue the earth, exercise dominion over every living thing, cultivate it, protect it, oversee it, develop it. Take control of your environment. God put Adam in the garden to tend it, to keep it under control. That's a good God-given desire and a command, that desire to control our environment. Part of exercising that desire is creating an environment of peace, stability, clarity, and predictability to the best of our ability. And that's good. That's a positive thing to do. As humans, we've been given authority by God to take charge of and organize our environment. We build, we organize, we discover, we learn, we protect, we develop, we do all of those things. But we haven't been given authority or the ability to control ultimate outcomes or suffering or other people's hearts or tomorrow or life and death or the mysteries of God. Job was upright and blameless. He raised a great family. He built wealth. He exercised his God-given desire to shape the world around him. The desire to work and produce good outcomes through stewardship. That's what Job did, and that's what we should do. But now Job has come to the boundary between human stewardship and the mysteries of God, the things that are God's responsibility alone. And just like any of us, he's looking for explanations and answers. And that's a crossroad. when we come to that boundary, the boundary between human knowledge and stewardship and the mysteries of God and his responsibilities. That's a crossroads. One road leads to deeper faith and trust, and the other to resentment and bitterment. When we stand at that intersection, the road we take is really determined by the question we ask. We can ask, how do I respond faithfully to what I don't understand? That road leads to faith and trust. Or we can ask, how do I gain mastery over what's happening? How do I control what's happening? We distort our stewardship and understanding when we move from cultivating our corner of creation to attempting to manage realities that only God can govern. The things that only God governs are often a mystery to us, the mysteries of God. We don't understand them. We can't control them. And Job now sees that with clarity as God asks him these questions. Where were you when the foundation of the earth was laid? He's like, wow, I don't know. I have no idea. That's beyond me. The Bible speaks of sin and transgression, and sin is missing the mark. It's fallen short of the standard God has set. It's kind of like archery. You're shooting at a target, you miss the bullseye, you miss the mark. That's sin. You miss the standard God has set. And transgression is crossing over a boundary God has set, transgressing the boundary. And suffering often reveals that we have taken our good God-given desire to exercise authority over our environment, and we've taken that over the boundary to where the mysteries of God take over and where things are his responsibility alone. You think about the questions God asked Job, and I think it's interesting that they're all questions about creation. Can you command the dawn? Can you store snow? Can you sustain the world? God created us to bring order and understanding to the world. We build houses, solve problems, cultivate land, create systems. We educate our children. We learn ourselves. God has given both the command and the desire to do that. Suffering often clarifies the boundaries of that desire. Have you ever been through that? You've been through suffering and it just clarifies everything for you. Like a lot of the nonsense just falls away. I've done, 50 or 60 funerals probably. And at funerals, that's one of the best places to preach the gospel because everybody's walls are down at a funeral. Suffering just kind of pulls away all the nonsense and clarifies things for us. We're created to steward, but not exercise ultimate control. We don't have the knowledge, the wisdom, or position to do that. And I think a lot of our fear, our suffering, our anxiety, our stress, dissatisfaction, it comes from trying to overstep our boundaries and take responsibility for things that are not our responsibility. Not all of it, of course. It's rarely an all statement, but a lot of that stuff, fear and suffering, anxiety, comes from us trying to take responsibility for things that are outside of our responsibility. And, sometimes we attempt to take on the responsibilities of other people. And sometimes we attempt to take on the responsibilities that belong to God alone. And suffering often exposes where stewardship has subtly and quietly transgressed into control. And part of finding peace is seeing those boundaries clearly, the boundaries between our stewardship and knowledge and God's responsibility and the mysteries of God. And we want to see those boundaries clearly. So how do we do that? In Romans 11:33, Paul says, "Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and unfathomable are his ways." Yeah, Paul went through a lot. If you read about him, you'd know that. He was stoned, beaten, whipped, shipwrecked, left for dead, hungry, cold. He suffered a lot. And in those times, Paul took the road of deeper faith and trust. And he's not angry that God is beyond him. He celebrates that God is beyond him. He's in awe of the fact that God is beyond him. And in that awe, he finds peace and joy. We find peace when awe for God replaces our desire for control. And maturing spiritually is discovering that peace comes from knowing God's character and also knowing that there are mysteries that we don't understand, and yet He does. And peace comes from being in awe of the things we don't understand, which sounds very counterintuitive. And Paul writes, how unsearchable are his judgments, how unfathomable are his ways. And Paul recognizes that God's wisdom isn't just bigger or more than human wisdom, it's categorically different. It's unsearchable, it's unfathomable. And trying to understand the mysteries of God, it's kind of like trying to pour the ocean into a coffee cup. It's impossible. It's counterintuitive because we want to control everything. But where we stand in awe of the mysteries of God and our lack of understanding of those things is where we find peace. Of course, we learn about God's character. We learn as much as we can about Him. But there's mysteries of God that we just don't know. The world tells us, master your reality, curate your life, engineer certainty, hustle, make it happen. And a lot of that stuff is fine. There's really nothing wrong with it until it crosses over the boundary of stewardship under God into responsibility for what only God knows. The world says, take control of your life. God says, steward your life. And obviously, God's not threatened by human efforts to take control. It's comical to think that He would be. Reminds me of the Psalms. Why do the heathen rage? You know, God, God could let us struggle in our discontent, our anxiety, perpetually. He could just leave us there. But I think suffering is often a tool that God uses to help clarify the boundary between human understanding and the mysteries of God, to help clarify when we've overstepped our boundary. When we see that boundary and we trust God beyond it, it's the mysteries of God that grow us in our awe of Him and direct us to trust Him. In the things of God, the mysteries of God pass our understanding, that are past our understanding, that's where we find peace. You know, what the New Testament calls peace that surpasses understanding. God uses what we can't understand to help us see that He does. And we may not understand the mystery and greatness of God, but if we don't see it in difficult circumstances, we will see nothing but difficulty. We sometimes forget that God can accomplish great things where all we see is chaos and suffering. We say there's no possible good outcome here. This is horrible. God can do great things in that place. And the cross shows us that. What looked like chaos, injustice, confusion, even victory for evil, from a human perspective, is where God accomplished redemption. The gospel gives us a glimpse into the mysteries of God and how we don't understand how He works. Just like we can with Job, we can look back at the cross now and understand that Christ suffered and died to pay the price for our sin and redemption. And when we look to Him in faith, He reconciles us with God. But had we been there that day, had we not had Scripture to look back on, we wouldn't have understood it the way we do now. We would have been confused and it would have been a mess. The disciples didn't understand it. When Jesus was arrested, Scripture says they forsook Jesus and fled. And then they went and hid in fear. They hid behind locked doors. There was sorrow, confusion, disbelief. And from their perspective, they had just watched their teacher and friend suffer and die a horrible death. And everything they thought was going to happen was gone. Their hope was gone. All the time that they had spent following Jesus was gone. Maybe they felt like it was wasted. Simon Peter said, I'm going fishing. He's just going to go fall back into his old way of life. And when they heard he was alive, they didn't believe it. Now, but here's the kicker about that. Before all that happened, Matthew 16:21 tells us that Jesus specifically told his disciples that he was going to Jerusalem, that he was going to suffer and die, and that he would be resurrected on the third day. And the same verse says Jesus began to do that from that day forth. So he told them what was going to happen multiple times, but they didn't see it. They heard it, but they didn't see it. Simon Peter said, "Far be it from you, Lord. This shall never happen to you." See, and Peter, the reason he says that is because he has a plan of his own, just like we often do. The disciples thought Jesus was going to go into Jerusalem, set himself up as king, cast off the Roman Empire, redeem the nation of Israel. And that's what they thought he was going to do. And when Jesus says, he's going to go to Jerusalem, he's going to suffer, he's going to die, Peter's like, no, you can't do that because that doesn't fit our plan for you. And they probably thought that's the reason he was going to Jerusalem, was to set himself up as king. And even though he told them multiple times, I wonder if they missed what he said because they had already made assumptions about what he was doing. They had an idea in their head that kind of shut everything else out. And that happens to us sometimes. When we look at the Old Testament prophecy, or we look, there's so many prophecies about Jesus in the Old Testament. We look at the story of Jesus' disciples, his crucifixion and resurrection. Often there is a time of hearing. Then there's a time of waiting. Then often confusion about what people think is supposed to happen. And then seeing. And assumptions made between hearing and seeing are often dangerous. Sometimes we hear but don't see because we've already decided what faithfulness, blessing, victory, rescue are supposed to look like, what relief from suffering is supposed to look like. We've already made an assumption about it. And then we live like that assumption is true when God has something different planned. Often when we suffer, we've already decided what peace is supposed to look like instead of seeing the mysteries of God and finding peace in Him. The disciples heard what Jesus said, but they didn't see until Jesus was resurrected. They heard. They heard what Jesus said. He told them many times what was going to happen. And they didn't believe when he said when they heard he was resurrected. They didn't see until they saw Jesus resurrected. They saw him and then they're like, oh, okay, now we get it. Their perspective changed. Their previous perspective was based on their own assumptions. Then they went from hiding behind locked doors to boldly preaching that Jesus is resurrected from the grave. And if you're a Christian today, you and I are here because of that. When you think about, your spiritual lineage, someone at some point, if you're a believer, shared the gospel with you. And someone had shared it with them, and someone had shared it with them. And you can trace it all the way back to that day, to when the disciples saw Jesus resurrected. That's where that started. Mystery is righteously framed in the cross. The cross is the clearest declaration that God can be fully good, fully wise, and still permit immense suffering for purposes beyond immediate human understanding. The cross is where God took control of sin and death because we can't. But if we were there that day, it would have just looked like chaos and loss and defeat. And we can hear about Jesus, but until we see that, we're lost and will remain so. Job places his hand over his mouth, not because God crushed him or shamed him or rejected him, but because God gave him perspective. Peace is found when we stop trying to take control in a place where only the mysteries of God stand. How are we going to apply that this week? Grow. Ask yourself honestly, where have I assumed I fully understand what God should be doing? We all do it somewhere. We all think we know what He's doing. what he should be doing, why something is something happening to someone else. Where have we assumed that we understand what God is doing? And, have I confused my perspective with God's perspective? Have I stepped over that boundary into the things that are the mysteries of God, into things that are only his responsibility and understanding? Am I demanding explanations before I trust him? Formation deepens when we ask honest questions while remaining humble about our conclusions. Live. Practice surrender where you most want control. We all want to control something somewhere that we really can't control. Maybe it's your kids. I don't know. Maybe it's something at work. You're not responsible for carrying omniscience or omnipotence. We're not all knowing. We're not all powerful. And we don't have to be. We're not required to fully understand every circumstance before we walk through it faithfully. You don't have to understand before you move in faith. Sometimes peace comes from not from getting answers, but from finally accepting our position before God and realizing that there are mysteries of God that I do not understand. There are things that he is solely responsible for, and I trust him in that. And of course, that doesn't mean we don't seek knowledge. We don't seek wisdom. We don't act rationally. Of course, we do those things. But there are things outside of the limits of our understanding that only God understands, and we have to trust him in those. And there's like Job, there's a moment when mature faith says, I've spoken of things too wonderful for me. That's not despair. That's perspective. That's understanding. That's seeing is what that is. It's not despair. It's perspective. And lastly, go. Carry humility into a world obsessed with certainty. I think people are exhausted from pretending they fully understand everything. There's an expert on everything everywhere. Experts on suffering, justice, motives, politics, God, life, theology, you name it. Be somebody steady enough to admit mystery without wavering in your faith. Because it's the mysteries of God that make him great. We sometimes forget that, thinking we have to have an answer for everything. We don't. We can't have an answer for everything. There are things about God that we do not understand. And that's what makes him amazing. And we should be in awe of that. And that doesn't mean giving up intelligence or reason or any of that nonsense. But it's in the mystery that we gain perspective. Not every hurting person needs a simplistic answer. Sometimes they just need someone calm enough to trust God in the middle of unanswered questions. I want to help people, but I need your help to do that. If this episode has encouraged you, challenged you, or helped give perspective maybe to something you're walking through, consider sharing it with someone who may be carrying unanswered questions or difficult circumstances. And if you haven't already, follow Walking with Conviction in an Anxious Age on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. It's on all major platforms. That simple step really does help more people discover the podcast. And I really want to help people as much as I can. We live in a world obsessed with certainty, quick answers, and control. But mature faith learns to trust God, even when our understanding reaches its limits. Grace and peace. I'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to Walking with Conviction in an Anxious Age. As you go, remember, following Jesus isn't about having all the answers, but walking faithfully with the truth you've been given. Stay present, think clearly, walk intentionally. And wherever Jesus leads you this week, keep walking, faithful, grounded, and free.